The skies over Europe in 1944 were a place of extreme danger, where every cloud, every gust of wind, every second of distraction could be crucial. It was a theater of operations where young men, many still with boyish faces, climbed into aluminum machines and dreams to confront an enemy that had transformed air defense into a highly developed science. This is the story of one of those men, a rookie pilot who faced the impossible and survived to tell a story that would defy all military logic and all expectations of survival. When we talk about combat aviation in World War II, we often imagine veteran aces, those pilots with dozens of missions under their belts, reflexes sharpened by experience, and instincts honed through countless combat situations. But the reality of aerial warfare was different. Most of the pilots crossing the English Channel to the European continent were young men with only a few dozen hours of combat flight time, men who had learned to fly in safe training camps in America or England, and who now faced the most sophisticated anti-aircraft defense network ever built by humankind. The North American P-51 Mustang was considered by many to be the best escort fighter of the war. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same one that powered the British Spitfires, the Mustang combined speed, range, and maneuverability in a way that no other American aircraft had achieved before. Capable of escorting bombers to the heart of Germany and returning to base, the Mustang had fundamentally changed Allied air strategy. But even the best machine in the world was only as good as the man sitting in its cockpit, and when that man was a rookie, the chances of survival dropped drastically. German air defense in 1944 was a masterpiece of military engineering and tactical coordination. The Flak system, short for Fliegerwerkkanon, had evolved from simple anti-aircraft guns into an integrated network of radars, searchlights, barrage balloons, and gun batteries capable of saturating the sky with thousands of explosive projectiles. The 88mm guns, feared both on the ground and in the air, could fire projectiles at supersonic speeds, creating explosions that severely damaged the metal structures of aircraft in a matter of seconds. But the real danger wasn't just in the cannons themselves. It was in the coordination, in the way the Germans had created a system where multiple batteries could be directed simultaneously against a single target, creating what Allied pilots called maximum danger zones in the sky. Areas of airspace where the density of anti-aircraft fire was so intense that it seemed impossible to cross them without being hit. And it was precisely through one of these maximum danger zones that our young pilot was about to fly. The day began like so many others that European spring. The sky was partly cloudy, with reasonable visibility, conditions considered suitable for escort missions. Briefings had been conducted, routes plotted, targets identified. Hundreds of B-17 and B-24 bombers would take off toward strategic targets in the German interior, and the Mustangs would accompany them, protecting them from enemy fighters and, when possible, suppressing enemy anti-aircraft defenses. Our pilot, whose name and identity remain on military records that we respect, had completed only 3 combat missions before that day. 3 missions in which he had flown in close formation with his squadron, following orders, holding position, doing exactly what he had been taught. 3 missions in which he had seen the sky light up with anti-aircraft explosions, but had never been the main focus of enemy fire. All of that was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. The formation took off on schedule, dozens of Mustangs spiraling up to their cruising altitude, forming a protective escort around the heavy bombers that followed in their meticulously maintained battle crates. The crossing of the channel was uneventful, only the roar of the engines and the occasional radio command breaking the monotony of the formation flight. But everyone knew that the tranquility was temporary. Once over the continent, everything could change in seconds. And it changed. The first indication of trouble came in the form of an urgent radio call, partially distorted by static and enemy interference that the Germans had become masters at creating. Enemy fighters had been spotted climbing up to intercept the formation. The squadron dispersed into combat pairs, each pair of Mustangs assuming their role in defending the formation. It was at this moment, in this initial dispersal, that our young pilot made the mistake that would determine everything that followed. In the confusion of the maneuver, he lost his wingman. In combat aviation, flying alone was extremely dangerous. The partner system had been developed because 2 pairs of eyes were infinitely better than 1, because a lone pilot couldn't watch all directions at once, because survival depended on mutual vigilance. And now he was alone, desperately searching for his partner in the sky filled with moving aircraft, trying to rejoin the formation while maintaining situational awareness of the three-dimensional battlefield around him. That's when he saw it. A group of German fighters, probably Focke-Wulf 190s judging by the silhouette, diving on a lone bomber that had broken out of formation, possibly damaged by previous anti-aircraft fire. Training kicked in, the instinct to protect the bombers that was hammered into every escort pilot. Without thinking of the consequences, without considering that he was alone and unsupported, he pushed the throttle forward and dove to intercept. The Mustang responded instantly, its speed increasing dramatically as it descended from the 20,000 feet where the formation flew. The speedometer went from 300 to 400 miles per hour in a matter of seconds. It had the advantage of altitude, the advantage of surprise, and the advantage of speed. What it lacked was experience, backup, or any real notion of what was about to happen. The German fighters saw him coming, but too late. He managed to disperse them with a burst from his .50 caliber machine guns, 6 weapons capable of unleashing a devastating volume of fire. The Focke-Wulfs retreated, abandoning their attack on the bomber, and for a brief moment, our young pilot felt the thrill of victory. He had saved that bomber. He had done exactly what was expected of an escort pilot. But the thrill lasted only seconds, because it was at that moment that he realized where he was. The bomber he had saved was flying alone because it was desperately trying to return to England after being hit. And to do that, it was flying low, very low, trying to stay under German radar and avoid further fighter attacks. In diving to save it, our young pilot had descended to less than 5,000 feet, directly over one of the most densely defended areas of occupied Europe. He was now at the perfect altitude for medium-caliber anti-aircraft guns, and had alerted the entire German defense network to his presence. The sky around him exploded. It wasn't gradual, not one projectile here and another there. It was a wall of anti-aircraft fire that suddenly materialized in all directions. Black and orange explosions marked the sky, each hurling hundreds of metal fragments at high speed in every direction. The sound was deafening even inside the cockpit, even with the flight helmet on. Each explosion was felt as much as heard, a pressure wave that shook the aircraft and reminded the pilot of how fragile the aluminum was that separated him from destruction. Later, intelligence analysis would determine that he had flown directly over a concentration of 10 anti-aircraft artillery positions, each containing multiple cannons. These were not the small 20 or 40 millimeter automatic weapons. These were the heavy weapons, the 88 millimeters and even some 105 millimeter cannons, weapons that had originally been designed to destroy tanks but had proven equally effective against aircraft. The standard protocol when facing intense anti-aircraft fire was clear. Gain altitude immediately, get out of the danger zone, return to the relative safety of higher altitudes where only the largest guns could reach you and where accuracy decreased drastically. That's what training dictated, that's what experience taught, that's what any veteran pilot would have done without hesitation. But our young pilot, on his third day of real combat, did something different. He descended even further. The logic, if we can call it that, was simple and born of panic. If the fire was coming from all directions at his current altitude, perhaps if he lowered himself, so low that the cannons couldn't depress enough to target him, perhaps he would have a chance. It was a logic of desperation, the kind of decision one makes when all options seem extremely dangerous and the instinct for survival overrides rational training. He pushed the Mustang's nose down and dove, the speedometer now exceeding 450 miles per hour, approaching the aircraft's structural limits. The world became a blur of green and brown, fields and forests of the European landscape rushing past him at breakneck speed. And for a moment, just a moment, the anti-aircraft fire seemed to diminish, the explosions growing slightly louder as he descended below the optimal engagement zone for the guns. But the German gunners were no novices. They had seen this maneuver before, they had been trained for exactly this eventuality. What happened next was a demonstration of the sophistication of the German air defense system. The batteries began to coordinate, using field telephones and even rudimentary mechanical computing systems that calculated trajectories and timed explosions. They were no longer shooting where he was. They were shooting where he would be. Explosions began to appear ahead of the Mustang, a curtain of detonations that moved with it, anticipating its every move. It was as if the sky had developed consciousness, as if the clouds and air themselves had become hostile and determined to destroy it. Fragments of debris began to strike the aircraft, sharp metallic sounds that could be heard even over the roar of the engine. A large enough piece hit the left wing, tearing an irregular line in the aluminum skin, and suddenly the aircraft began to vibrate, the compromised aerodynamics creating an asymmetrical drag that tried to pull the Mustang to the left. At this point, any combat flight manual would have said to eject or make an emergency landing. The aircraft was damaged, he was alone, deep behind enemy lines, and being bombarded by 10 artillery positions that had now found their range and flight pattern. The chances of survival were statistically negligible. But ejecting meant certain capture, years in a prisoner-of-war camp with an uncertain future. And something in that young pilot, something that transcended training and logic, refused to give up. He began to perform what pilots called gene car, violent and unpredictable evasive maneuvers that made it difficult for gunners to predict his future position. But gene carrying at low altitude with a damaged aircraft was like dancing on the edge of a precipice during an earthquake. Every sharp movement risked loss of control. Every steep tilt could be his last if the damaged wing structure couldn't withstand the load. And yet, he continued, throwing the Mustang from side to side, rising and falling in patterns that even he couldn't predict. It was during one of these maneuvers that something extraordinary happened, something that would be debated in intelligence reports and briefing rooms for weeks afterward. One of the anti-aircraft batteries simply stopped firing. Not because it ran out of ammunition, not because it was destroyed by some friendly attack. It stopped because the gunners, seeing that lone Mustang dancing through an inferno of its own fire, saw something that momentarily superseded their training and duty. German radio intercepts later revealed fragments of communications from that battery. The position commander had tried to coordinate his fire with the other batteries, but his orders were being questioned by his own men. The exact words were lost in static and imperfect translation, but the essence was clear. They were saying that they couldn't lead that target, that the pilot was flying in a way that defied their calculations and predictions, that trying to coordinate with him was like trying to shoot a ghost. But a silenced battery didn't mean salvation. There were still 9 other firing positions, and they didn't share the same hesitation. The sky remained a storm of metal and explosives. Another wave of shrapnel swept over the Mustang, this time hitting the rear fuselage. He felt the impact through the aircraft's structure, like someone hitting a giant drum from the inside. Rudder control became heavier, harder to move, suggesting damage to the control system or the rudder surface itself. The landscape below him was rushing by at breakneck speed, fields giving way to villages, villages giving way to more fields, a tapestry of occupied territory stretching to the horizon. He vaguely knew where he was from basic celestial navigation and his watch, but details were impossible to discern. His attention was divided between keeping the plane airborne, avoiding anti-aircraft fire, and trying to find a course that would lead him back to the safety of Allied lines. It was then that he saw something that made his heart sink even further. Ahead, perhaps 5 miles away, was a column of smoke rising heavily into the sky. Black smoke, the kind that came from burning fuel, the kind that marked where an aircraft had crashed. For a terrifying moment, he thought it might be his wingman, the man he had lost early in the combat. But then he realized the smoke was too heavy, too voluminous to be a single fighter. It was a bomber, probably a B-17 or B-24, that had been shot down and was now burning in the French fields. The sight of it brought a cold clarity. That bomber represented lost lives, perhaps an entire crew. They had fallen fulfilling their mission, fighting the same enemy that now threatened him. And somehow that sight crystallized his own resolve. He was not going to become another statistic in the tally of aerial warfare. He was going to survive no matter the cost. The explosions continued, but now he was developing a kind of sense for them, an instinct born of desperation and necessity. He could see where the clouds of explosions were forming and begin his evasive maneuver before the debris even scattered. It was as if his brain had shifted into a higher gear, processing information at superhuman speed, seeing patterns where before there had only been chaos. Later, scientists would study this phenomenon, this state of hyper-awareness that some pilots experienced in extreme combat. They would discover that the human brain, when confronted with extreme danger, can accelerate its information processing, make time seem to pass more slowly, allow reflexes to be executed before conscious thought even registers the threat. It was evolution working in real time, the survival of the fittest being demonstrated in the skies over Europe. But even with this heightened awareness, even with his instincts sharpened to the maximum, he was losing the battle. The Mustang was accumulating damage. The left wing now had multiple holes, some small as coins, others large enough to fit a fist through. The left winglet was partially locked, making leftward leans slow and heavy. The engine was beginning to exhibit erratic vibrations, suggesting that one or more cylinders had been damaged by shrapnel that had somehow penetrated the engine cowling. And then, almost like a miracle, almost as if the universe had decided he had suffered enough, the anti-aircraft fire began to diminish. It didn't stop completely, but the intensity reduced from absolute hell to something that could only be described as extremely dangerous. He had crossed the most densely defended zone. He had survived what should have been impossible to survive. The batteries behind him were still firing, but now he was at the limit of their effective range, and each second was taking him further away. He began to gain altitude cautiously, testing the aircraft's controls, feeling how it responded to his multiple injuries. The Mustang was flying, but it was flying like a damaged aircraft, requiring constant attention and compensation for controls that no longer responded as they should. But it was flying, and that was all that mattered. The altitude climbed from 1,000 feet to 2,000, then 3,000. At 5,000 feet, he finally allowed himself to breathe, allowed himself to think that perhaps, just perhaps, he would actually survive this. The radio, which had been a useless cacophony of transmissions during the combat, was now relatively silent. He tried to contact his squadron, but received only static. Either his radio was damaged, or he was too far away, or everyone else had returned to base presuming he had been shot down. The loneliness of that moment was profound, flying over enemy territory in a damaged aircraft without knowing if anyone knew he was still alive. But he had navigation equipment, he had his watch, he had the sun for guidance. And he had a magnetic compass which, at least at that moment, seemed to still be working. He set a rough course west-northwest, in the direction of England, and set out for what he knew would be a long and dangerous flight back. Minutes turned into half-hours, and half-hours felt like eternities. Every strange engine noise made his heart stop. Every unexpected vibration made him prepare to eject. The fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should, suggesting a leak somewhere in the system. He did quick mental calculations and realized he would be in a tight spot, very tight. He might have enough fuel to reach England, or he might not. There was no way to know for sure with a compromised fuel system. The landscape below gradually changed from rural to more densely populated, then back to rural as he crossed occupied France. He flew over small towns and villages that probably didn't even know a war was being fought thousands of feet above them. He saw roads and railways, the lifeblood of the German war machine, and part of him wished he had ammunition left over to cause some damage. But his machine guns had fallen silent since that brief initial engagement, and in any case, his mission now was survival, not destruction. He crossed the French coast at some point he couldn't identify, watching the beaches and cliffs give way to the gray-blue of the English Channel. And it was then, seeing that expanse of water between him and safety, that he allowed himself to feel the first real spark of hope. The channel could be crossed even by a damaged aircraft. If he could keep the Mustang in the air for another 20 or 30 minutes, he would be home. The engine chose that moment to remind him that nothing was guaranteed. The vibration increased dramatically, and suddenly there was smoke. Not much, but enough to be visible, leaking from the edges of the engine cowling. The oil temperature was rising. The oil pressure was dropping. All classic signs of an engine that was heading for catastrophic failure. He reduced power to the minimum necessary to maintain level flight, trying to give the engine any chance to continue running just a little longer. The English coast lay ahead like a promise, like salvation. He could see the white cliffs, he could see the green fields beyond, he could see civilization and safety. But he could also see that the engine was deteriorating, the smoke growing thicker, the vibration becoming so severe that he could see the instrument panel flickering in front of him. He wouldn't make it to his base. He would be lucky to reach land before the engine exploded or seized up completely. He spotted a field just beyond the coast, a large and reasonably flat field that looked like a possibility for an emergency landing. There was no time to be selective, no time to search for a suitable landing field. This field would have to do. He established his approach, checking the controls one last time, discovering that the left aileron was now almost completely unresponsive and that the rudder required significant force to move. The landing would be done primarily with engine power and depth control, with only minimal aileron and rudder touches. It was the type of landing that flight instructors would consider virtually impossible, but he had no choice. He cut power, let the nose drop, and committed to the approach. The Mustang descended toward the field, its speed dropping through 120, 110, 100 miles per hour. The ground rose to meet him faster than expected, the lack of control making it difficult to get the angle perfectly right. The impact was heavy, the rear wheel striking first, followed by the main wheels hitting hard enough to make their teeth chatter. But the wheels held, the landing gear didn't collapse, and suddenly he was on the ground, rolling across the English countryside, grass and earth flying as he struggled to keep the plane reasonably straight with a rudder that barely responded. He applied the brakes gently, not wanting to risk a rollover at this stage, and gradually, miraculously, the Mustang slowed down and came to a stop. For a long moment he just sat in the cockpit, hands still on the control stick, unable to fully process that he had survived. His body was trembling, adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion and shock. He shut down the aircraft systems out of habit, post-flight checks running on mental autopilot even as his conscious mind was still trying to comprehend that he was alive. When he finally descended from the aircraft and stood on the English grass, his legs nearly gave way beneath him. He walked around the Mustang, truly seeing for the first time the extent of the damage. The aircraft looked like Swiss cheese, dozens and dozens of holes piercing the fuselage and wings. How it had continued flying was almost beyond comprehension. The engine was leaking oil and hydraulic fluid, creating a dark puddle beneath the aircraft. Another half-hour of flight and it would surely have fallen from the sky. Local farmers began to arrive, having witnessed the emergency landing. They offered help, offered transport, and he gratefully accepted. A call was made to his base, reporting that he was alive, that he had landed safely, and that he needed transport back. The response on the other end of the line was one of incredulous shock. They had listed him as missing in action, presumably shot down over France. No one expected to hear from him again. The debriefing that followed when he finally returned to base was extensive and detailed. Intelligence officers wanted to know everything: the number of anti-aircraft batteries, their locations, their firing patterns, how they coordinated. They wanted to map the German defense network, identify vulnerabilities, develop tactics, and he recounted everything he could remember, although parts of the experience were already beginning to become hazy, filtered through the lens of trauma and exhaustion. But the part that really intrigued the intelligence officers was the account of the German radio intercepts. That battery that had stopped firing, the gunners saying they couldn't lead the target, the apparent collapse of command that had occurred. It was unprecedented. German artillery batteries were known for their discipline, for continuing to fire even under heavy bombardment, for executing their orders without question. That an entire battery had essentially refused to continue firing because the target was flying too unpredictably was something new. Subsequent analyses would suggest several theories. Perhaps the gunners, many of whom were veterans who had seen years of war, were genuinely impressed by the flying skill, even recognizing that it came from an enemy. Perhaps they recognized that a pilot capable of flying in that manner in a clearly damaged aircraft was someone worthy of a certain amount of reluctant respect. Or perhaps, and this was the most disturbing theory for the German commanders who were captured and later interrogated, it was an early indication of eroding morale, a sign that even German soldiers were beginning to question the usefulness of continuing a war that many already felt was lost. As for our young pilot, he flew many more missions before the end of the war. But he never flew alone again, never lost his wingman again, and never underestimated what could happen when you flew low over enemy territory. The experience had changed him, matured him from rookie to veteran in a single brutal mission. He developed a reputation among his squadron as someone who simply couldn't be shot down, someone who had survived the impossible. Years after the war, when he was an older man and could look back on that day with perspective and distance, He would talk about it in terms that transcended mere luck or skill. He would talk about moments when he felt he wasn't alone in that cabin, moments when his hands seemed to move the controls with a certainty that went beyond his own limited experience. He would talk about a feeling of being guided, of being protected, of being in the hands of something greater than himself. Science could explain some aspects of what happened that day. The adrenaline-induced state of heightened awareness, the automated reflexes that training had instilled, the robust construction of the P-51 Mustang that allowed it to continue flying even with extensive damage. All of that was real, all of that was verifiable. But for those who lived through those moments, for that young pilot dancing through a hell of anti-aircraft fire, there was something more, something that purely material explanations couldn't fully capture. What happened that day over occupied France became part of combat aviation folklore. The story was told and retold in operations rooms, officers' bars, and flight schools. Details were added, some true, some embellished. But the core of the story remained. A rookie pilot had entered the gauntlet of 10 anti-aircraft artillery positions and had come out the other side, flying an aircraft so damaged that by all rights it should have fallen from the sky. For German artillery commanders, it was a lesson in the limitations of even the best weapon systems when confronted with a human operator acting in unpredictable ways. For Allied pilots, it was a story of hope, proof that even the most desperate situations could be survived with skill, determination, and perhaps a little divine providence. And for military historians who studied the event in the years that followed, it was a fascinating case study in how complex systems could fail in unexpected ways, how human nature could interfere even with the most rigorous military protocols. But perhaps the most profound lesson comes when we consider what those German gunners felt in that moment when they were told they couldn't lead the target. Amidst the dehumanization of modern industrial warfare, amidst the impersonal machinery of conflict, there was a moment of recognition. A recognition that there was another human being on that aircraft, someone desperately fighting for survival, someone demonstrating a will to live that transcended nationality or ideology. They didn't stop firing out of sympathy for the enemy, not in the conventional sense. They stopped because, for a brief moment, they saw something that reminded them of the shared humanity that war tried to make us forget. They saw courage, they saw skill, they saw determination, and these qualities commanded a response that went beyond orders or training. It was a moment of humanity breaking through the crust of war, a moment that suggests that even in the most brutal contexts, the human spirit retains some capacity to recognize value in others, even in adversaries. The war would end a few months later, and that young pilot would return home to a life far from the skies of combat. But he would carry that experience with him for the rest of his life. Not as a trauma, although there were certainly traumatic elements, but as a defining moment, a moment in which he discovered reserves of courage and ability he didn't know he possessed. It was a story he would tell his children and grandchildren, a story about facing the impossible and surviving, about machines and men, about war and humanity. And for us, looking back through the decades, it's a reminder that history isn't made only by generals and politicians, by grand strategies and mass movements. It's also made by individuals, by unique moments of crisis and choice, by split-second decisions that can mean the difference between success and failure. It's made by young men who climb into flying machines and do extraordinary things, not because they are heroes of some mythical mold, but because they are human beings confronted with extreme circumstances and responding with everything they have. The Mustang he flew that day never flew again. The damage was too extensive, the repair cost too high. It was dismantled, its parts used to keep other aircraft airborne. But before being dismantled, it was photographed extensively, intelligence officers wanting complete documentation of the types of damage an aircraft could sustain and still remain flyable. These photographs exist to this day in military archives, silent testimony to an extraordinary day. Looking at these photographs, seeing the countless holes piercing the fuselage, seeing the aileron almost severed, seeing the scars of anti-aircraft fire all over the aircraft, it's almost impossible to believe that anyone could have flown it back to England. It defies logic, it defies probability. And yet, it happened. The evidence is there in the photographs, in the official records, in the debriefing reports. Some people would attribute it entirely to the superior construction of the P-51 Mustang. And certainly, the aircraft was well built, capable of absorbing tremendous punishment. But engineers who examined the damage later noted that several of the hits were dangerously close to critical systems. A hit just inches in a different direction could have severed control lines, fuel lines, or hydraulic lines in ways that would have rendered the aircraft uncontrollable. It was, they concluded, as much luck as engineering. Others would point to training, to the fact that even a novice pilot in the Allied Air Forces in 1944 had received hundreds of hours of instruction, had practiced emergency situations repeatedly, had been prepared as well as humanly possible for the challenges of aerial combat. And that was also true. But training can only take you so far. Eventually, you're on your own, relying on instinct and improvisation as much as on memorized procedures. And so we come to the conclusion that many of those who were there, who lived through those moments, had already achieved it. It was all of that. It was the machine, it was the training, it was the skill, it was luck, it was determination. But it was also something more, something that words struggle to adequately capture. It was a moment where human potential was stretched to its absolute limit, where someone did something that, by all rational calculations, should not have been possible. For that pilot, reflecting on it all years later, one thing remained clear above all others. He had gone into that day as a young man who thought he understood what it meant to be in combat, who thought that 3 previous missions had given him some understanding of aerial warfare. He emerged transformed, having faced extreme danger and having, against all odds, survived. It wasn't an experience he would wish on anyone, but it was one he wouldn't trade, because it had forged who he would become for the rest of his life. The story of that day reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite fear. It is continuing when every instinct screams at you to give up. It is finding within yourself resources you didn't know you possessed. It is a rookie pilot, alone and terrified, making a damaged aircraft dance through a storm of anti-aircraft fire because giving up simply wasn't an option he was willing to consider. It also reminds us that even in the most dehumanizing contexts, even when humans are reduced to targets and threats, there are still moments where our shared humanity shines through. Those German gunners who paused, who said they couldn't lead the target, they didn't become traitors in that moment. They became, for a brief instant, humans recognizing humanity, even across battle lines, even amidst intense conflict. And so, as we conclude this story, as we leave that young pilot resting in an English field, his impossible aircraft finally silent, his nerves finally beginning to calm, we do well to remember the lessons that Extraordinary Day offers, about courage and persistence, about the surprising capabilities of both humans and machines when pushed to their absolute limits, about moments of humanity amidst dehumanization, and about the irreducible mystery of how, sometimes, against all odds, against all reasonable expectation, people survive what should not be survivable. It was a day when the German anti-aircraft command collapsed, not through technical or tactical failure, but because they confronted something their systems couldn't adequately process. A single man determined to survive, flying with near-impossible skill, moving through their fields of fire in ways that defied prediction. It was a day when a rookie became a legend, not through bravado or showmanship, but through sheer, desperate determination to survive. And while the aircraft rested in that field, leaking vital fluids, its engine silent after carrying its pilot through the impossible, perhaps we can see in it a symbol of something greater, a symbol of resilience, of refusing to give up, of the belief that there is always a chance, no matter how small, no matter how improbable the odds. It is a lesson that transcends war, that speaks to all situations in which we are confronted with challenges that seem insurmountable. May we all, when confronted with our own battlefields, with our own moments of impossible crisis, find within ourselves a little of that same courage, that same refusal to give up. And may we recognize that, when we push through the impossible, we often discover that we had more strength within us than we ever imagined possible. May the Lord God bless all those who flew, all those who fought, and especially those who did not return. May their stories continue to inspire, and may we never forget the sacrifices that were made to secure the freedom we enjoy today.